The next topic is much less black and white for me, at least, and that's economic growth. I've asked you whether you think that the current economic model or infinite economic growth is compatible with a sustainable environment. Uh, Last year, about three-quarters of people said no, and it's increasingly a strong opinion that the global economic system is not consistent with future future sustainability. And this lecture is about the economy's role in sustainability and also in driving emissions and other environmental problems. It's not surprising again to see why economic growth is linked with CO2 emissions. So if we index CO2 emissions there globally at 100 in 1990 like this, with wealth, we can see what we call the start of a decoupling between emissions and wealth happening around now. This is projected on the new policy scenario, where each 1% increase in wealth in GDP per capita does not cause the same amount of CO2 emissions. That's because of improving economic energy intensity and also of decreasing carbon intensity. So energy really has a crucial role to play in global development. The potential for energy to improve living standards, whether that's freeing people from the time from doing laborious household chores like washing or cooking. It increases productivity. It gives us access to improved healthcare and services or digital connections to local, regional and global networks. And the link between energy consumption and economic growth has been a topic of wide discussion. There are empirical studies which look at different countries and what the link is between their emissions or economic development and growth. And I'd recommend a website, our World in Data/Energy, to explore those empirical limits. And it's certain that GDP per capita has been one of the strongest drivers of energy demand. And our prevailing economic theory is certainly founded on infinite economic growth, but there are kind of alternative economic paradigms which are challenging this. One book I mentioned was The Limits to Growth, which speaks about the fact that the Earth has a limited carrying capacity, and that our continual consumption of these resources is not sustainable. So that the kind of Earth system, the economic system and the energy system are somehow very much embedded in a wider environmental system, and we can't grow infinitely like this. So there are ecological economists and degrowth environmentalists who advocate for really changing our economic system. This is the topic of the first debate that we'll be encountering in week 7, and that's why I'm doing this lecture is so that people who are considering the pros and cons of changing the economic system can consider those options. Here are some of the different thinkers. I've mentioned Malthus already, which was more related to population growth, and Harden, Tragedy of the Commons, that any common good, any good that doesn't have property rights will be overburdened and exploited. Ehrlichs in 1968 said that overpopulation was the problem, and that depleted soils and disrupted ecosystems would cause famines by the 1980s, which didn't happen. Again, different Forrester, The Limits to Growth, said that there would be disaster within 100 years. And these things still debates still rage in different circles. How many people can the Earth support? Maybe 1 trillion, maybe 16 billion. We don't really know. But what we do know is that the real GDP of households has skyrocketed. The history of human living was pretty miserable until the Industrial Revolution, at least. Compared to the rapid increase in global GDP after 1800, all change before this was pretty was insignificant. It's not visible, and so life was pretty nasty, brutish, and short. Why is prosperity important? I hope I don't have to reiterate this, but living standards are so closely tied with income. Self-reported happiness of people is closely correlated with the level of prosperity, and poverty is a concept intrinsically linked to welfare. There are many ways that we can measure welfare. GDP is not ideal, but here's just general life satisfaction. If you look at the psychology literature around positive psychology and what creates happiness, the link between GDP and life satisfaction sort of topples out around here, so that, you know, extra income doesn't actually translate to higher life satisfaction, and we're certainly at that level. But at these lower levels, people are much more satisfied with their lives when they're not in dire poverty. And when we look at the numbers in extreme poverty, including projections to 2030, we're actually on a very strong success story. So growing GDP has actually led to strongly falling numbers of people in extreme poverty, especially in Asia. So, and you saw in the last lecture that strongest energy demand growth was in Asia, and that's not a surprise because so many people have been lifted out of poverty. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa, there are actually more people living in poverty now than there were in 1990, and that's because population growth has been extremely strong there. And so the last lecture was very important for that. The World Bank projects that still 500 million people will be in extreme poverty in 2050, and that will have impacts on population growth. And many people's well-being. The share of people living in absolute poverty is declining very, very quickly, and that's a very good thing. So now only around 10% of people are living in extreme poverty. You know, that's but 94% of people lived in extreme poverty in 1820 when these statistics started. And with that, we've seen a huge decrease in child mortality, probably one of the most significant indicators of development in industrialized countries today. Child mortality, the number of children who die before 5 years old, has fallen below 0.5%. And these are actually relatively very recent numbers. We live in an amazingly prosperous time when we don't have to worry so much about these huge tragedies happening to us. So nevertheless, there are still problems in low-income countries with this with a still unacceptably high level of child mortality. Another factor about global economic growth is the income distribution. And here, as Hans Rosling said in the last video, the world was quite divided in the 1980s with most people, this is population and their income. So most people in the 1980s earned around $500 a year. That's, you know, that's really tiny. And this is a logarithmic scale, actually. So this is $500, this is $5,000 in developed countries over here. So there was quite a big gap in income distribution. And actually that income distribution has closed. So people are getting wealthier, but also there's a bigger spread of incomes here. And this is a good thing. It widens the gap between rich and poor. And as a result of this, incomes are growing in all parts of the world, and global poverty is declining rapidly, and the fastest risers are here. So sub-Saharan Africa is really still the area of most concern. The next concept I wanted to introduce is that there is a concept called the environmental Goodsness curve that says that kind of at the start of economic development, often the level of environmental damage is quite high because there's rapid development, high intensity of using resources, low concern for the environment. There's a priority of development over environment, and then there's a turning point after which say there becomes more of a service-based economy, and there's concern for the environment, and more resources can be put into environmental preservation. So that as growing GDP per capita happens, the environmental degradation declines. And there is some empirical evidence of declining environmental impact at high levels of economic development. For example, we now have vehicle standards for which reduce air pollution from vehicles. There's no lead in petroleum anymore. We don't spray DDT on the land. You know, we have deal with sewage, and deforestation has actually declined in most, or even reversed in developed economies. And this is caused by technological innovation, spare incomes, higher value of the environment, living standards, health, and so on. But the question is, are wealthy economies just exporting their pollution? So I know that we import many of our goods from China, so our carbon footprint is actually allocated to China, even though because that's where they produce many of our goods. And there's a question about whether this relationship is casual or not. So is that decreasing environmental impact inevitable? So can we just say we grow and then eventually somehow our environmental impact will come down? What really matters is policy, it's regulation, technology development, concerted efforts, willingness to pay, education, which is why you're here, I hope. And that question. So that's the question whether we can do sustainable development. Sustainable development means continuing to grow our, say, GDP while reducing our impact, or do we need degrowth? Can we be sustainable within the current paradigm or not? That's the big question. That's an open question. Here's an example of some countries who have managed to reduce their CO2 emissions dramatically while at the same time increasing GDP. This is from a fantastic academic called Glenn Peters. I'd highly recommend that you follow him on Twitter, and I use many of his graphs. He's a member of the Global Carbon Budget group, and he's a really fantastic science communicator. So here, for example, well, first of all, it's to say that there's no single successful template of an ecologically benign economy. So every economy really has some ecological impact, but there are some examples that we can take. So for example, Denmark declined emissions at 5.5% per year in the 2010s. Very, very successful while growing its economy. Main impact there is renewable wind in its electricity generation and combined heat and power using biomass as a heat source. So that's a strongly, again, technology, regulation, innovation and policy drove all that. This graph here is Sweden. So here in the 1970s, there was a nuclear boom. Emissions reductions accounted for about 5% per year while GDP was growing at the same rate. But then once nuclear sort of saturated the electricity system, the fall in emissions leveled off. So the emissions continued to decline, but at a slower rate than that. Here we have Finland, another example of nuclear, but also hydro CHP district heat. CO2 emissions grew at 3.6% per year while growing GDP. Actually, Finland has the highest per capita energy consumption in the EU, apparently. But because they have high levels of renewables and nuclear, the CO2 emissions are not as great. Next example here is from France. Again, nuclear boom in the 1970s, but then emissions started to grow because once you can only kind of decarbonize your electricity system so much. This has very big implications for Ireland. If we only decarbonize electricity, we won't get that far unless we look at transport and heat. Here's the UK, and the CO2 emissions decline here at 3.5% per year have been mainly because of a switch away from coal. Gas and renewables have powered electricity generation in the last number of years in the UK, 3.5% per year. And here in Russia, you can see is not an example of how to sustainably reduce emissions. So in Russia, CO2 emissions fell by 7% per year, but GDP fell at a faster rate. So that's not something that we want to mimic. And there's a bunch of other countries where economic collapse has led to emissions reductions. The question is how we can do that sustainably. For context, the Irish target for decarbonisation by 2030 is 7% per year, and I think that of these 6 examples is the only. Russia here is the only example which reaches 7.5% or 7% per year, which is illustrative of the challenge that we have ahead. And now I leave you with one last thought: is do we need a new paradigm of growth? There's a book that I would recommend called The Value of Everything by Mariana Mazzucato. And I suppose the focus is on value. Oscar Wilde has a line that a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. And that provides an analysis of and a strategy of combating the notion that our kind of well-being is only wrapped up in financial growth, basically wealth as coming from the financial elite and things like that. So the measurement of GDP in the current paradigm is blind to the source of of growth. So, a growth in the sort of arms sector is just measured as positive GDP growth. Office block burning down or a building burning down and causing building activity is positive for GDP. And so this is the argument that we need to focus more on the value of GDP and of growth rather than the actual amount that we need to go back to almost 17th century economic theory, which where kind of economic value wasn't blind to what's needed. Another concept here is the sufficiency concept, that consumption linked to quality of life really levels off after a time, so that if you have very little, then additional consumption is great, but the more that you consume, then it's really excessive, that it's obsession, and that you gain much less more the more you consume. So this is a suggestion that we should not necessarily focus on degrowth, but changing the paradigm of how we value growth.